Long before the Dawes Act became law in 1887, Native American nations already understood what was coming. It did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, wrapped in promises, speeches, and paperwork. By the late 19th century, the United States had defeated most Native military resistance. The frontier wars were ending, reservations had been established, and the federal government faced what it called the Indian problem. The question was no longer how to fight Native people, but how to remake them. To understand the Dawes Act, it is important to understand how different Native ideas of land were from those of the United States. For most Native nations, land was not something to be owned by individuals. It belonged to the tribe as a whole. It was sacred, shared, and passed down through generations. Hunting grounds, rivers, forests, and plains were part of a living relationship between people and nature. Land could be used, respected, defended, but not bought and sold like a product. American society believed the opposite. Private land ownership was seen as the foundation of civilization. To American lawmakers, farms, fences, and deeds meant progress. Communal land meant backwardness. By the 1800s, many politicians, missionaries, and reformers convinced themselves that Native Americans could only survive if they abandoned tribal life and adopted white American customs. Farming small plots of land, living in single-family homes, speaking English, and practicing Christianity were presented as paths to survival. Reservations were supposed to protect native land, but they quickly became tools of control. Tribes were confined to specific areas, often far from their traditional homelands. These lands were frequently poor for farming and isolated from economic opportunity. The federal government controlled food rations, supplies, and movement. Starvation was common, and dependency grew. Officials used this dependency to pressure tribes into signing treaties that reduced T. After allotment began, everyday life for Native families changed in ways that were immediate and painful. What had once been shared land became scattered plots divided by survey lines drawn on maps far away from the people who lived there. Families who had hunted, farmed, and gathered together now found themselves separated by miles. Community life weakened, not because people wanted it to, but because the land itself no longer held them together. Government agents arrived on reservations with measuring tools and paperwork. They decided who qualified as the head of a household and who did not. Their judgments often ignored Native family structures, where extended families lived and worked together. Widows, elders, and orphans were sometimes given smaller allotments or none at all. In some cases, children were listed as landowners, even though they had no way to manage the land and no protection from those who wanted to take advantage of them. The promise that allotment would turn Native people into successful farmers quickly fell apart. Many allotments were located on dry plains, desert land, or rocky soil unsuitable for crops. Irrigation systems were rarely provided, and farming tools were scarce. Training programs were poorly funded or completely absent. Families who had lived as hunters or communal farmers were suddenly expected to survive as individual homesteaders without support. When crops failed, hunger followed. Rations that had once been distributed by the government were reduced or cut off entirely, based on the belief that assistance would prevent self-reliance. This left many families with no food and no income. Desperation forced some to lease their land to white farmers or ranchers for extremely low payments. Others sold their livestock or personal belongings just to survive. The trust system, which was supposed to protect Native landowners, became one of the most damaging parts of the Dawes Act. While land was held in trust, Native owners could not. By the 1920s, the effects of allotment were no longer hidden. Poverty on reservations had reached extreme levels. Land ownership was fragmented into tiny pieces, often shared by dozens of heirs, making farming or development nearly impossible. Many Native families were landowners in name only, holding rights to parcels they could not use, lease, or even locate on a map. What had been promoted as a path to independence had created deep dependence and widespread suffering. Public attention slowly began to turn toward these conditions. Journalists, educators, and social reformers started visiting reservations and writing about what they saw. Their reports described hunger, disease, overcrowded housing, and broken communities. These accounts challenged the long-standing claim that Native people were responsible for their own hardship. Instead, they pointed directly at federal policies, especially the Dawes Act. One of the most important moments came in 1928 with the publication of a major government study officially titled The Problem of Indian Administration. It became widely known as the Merriam Report, named after its lead author, Lewis Merriam. The report was blunt and deeply critical. It stated clearly that allotment had failed. It described the policy as poorly planned, badly administered, and destructive to Native life. The report documented land loss, corruption, inadequate education, and severe malnutrition. The Merriam Report also criticized boarding schools, describing them as overcrowded, underfunded, and harmful to children. It argued that forcing Native children to abandon their culture did not improve their lives. Instead, it left them disconnected from both Native and non-Native worlds. This official acknowledgement was rare and powerful. For the first time, a federal report admitted that the government itself had caused much of the suffering. At the same time, Native political activism was growing. Educated Native leaders began forming national organization. Even after allotment officially ended, the consequences of the Dawes Act continued to shape Native American life for generations. Laws could change, but the loss of land, culture, and stability could not be undone quickly. By the mid-20th century, Native nations were left with fractured land bases, weakened governments, and communities still struggling to recover from decades of enforced disruption. One of the most lasting problems created by the Dawes Act was land fractionation. As individual allotments were passed down through generations, ownership became divided among dozens, sometimes hundreds, of heirs. A single piece of land might belong to many people, each owning a small percentage. This made it almost impossible to use the land productively. Decisions required agreement from many owners, some of whom lived far away or did not even know they held an interest. Valuable land often sat unused while poverty persisted. Legal battles over land became common. Courts were flooded with cases involving disputed ownership, unfair sales, and stolen resources. Native families spent years trying to reclaim land taken through fraud or tax seizures. In many cases, the law favored those who had benefited from the original injustice. Even when wrongdoing was proven, returning land was rare. Compensation, when offered, was often small compared to the value of what was lost. Economic consequences followed closely. Without a stable land base, building businesses, homes, or infrastructure was difficult. Banks refused loans because land titles were unclear. Investors avoided reservations due to legal complexity. These barriers were not accidents. They were direct results of a policy designed without any concern for long-term Native prosperity. Cultural loss also continued to echo across generations. Many children raised during the allotment and boarding school era grew up disconnected from their language and traditions. Elders who carried cultural knowledge passed away without